The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Buckingham Palace as James Morrison adjusted his crisp uniform and took his position at the East Wing entrance. 23 years of faithful service had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated when something was amiss within the ancient walls of the royal residence. Today, those signs were everywhere. James had started his career as a junior security officer, working his way up through dedication and an unwavering commitment to protecting the royal family. His colleagues respected him not just for his professional competence, but for his genuine care for every person who lived and worked within the palace walls. From the most senior officials to the newest kitchen staff, James treated everyone with equal dignity and respect. The atmosphere in the palace had been tense for weeks. Staff members whispered in corners, their conversations stopping abruptly when senior officials passed by. James had noticed the pattern but hadn't understood its significance until yesterday evening, when he accidentally overheard a conversation that would change everything. It was past 11 o'clock when James was completing his final security rounds. The palace was quieter than usual, with most staff having retired for the evening. As he walked past the blue drawing room, he heard voices coming from within. The door was slightly ajar, and though his training told him to keep moving, something in the tone of the conversation made him pause. Queen Camilla's voice was unmistakable, though it carried an edge James had rarely heard before. She was speaking to someone about necessary changes and removing obstacles to proper palace management. The other voice belonged to Victoria Ashworth, the palace's deputy chief of staff, a woman known for her ambitious nature and unwavering loyalty to the queen consort. James pressed himself against the wall, knowing he was crossing a line but unable to walk away. What he heard next made his blood run cold. They were discussing a systematic plan to remove several long-serving staff members, people James had worked alongside for years. The conversation revealed a calculated effort to reshape the palace workforce, removing those seen as too loyal to the previous administration or too set in traditional ways. Margaret Thompson, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for 37 years, was first on their list. Her crime, according to the conversation James overheard, was being too attached to old protocols and showing insufficient enthusiasm for new initiatives. James knew Margaret as a woman of impeccable character, who had trained dozens of staff members and maintained the palace's standards through multiple transitions. Thomas Bradley, the senior footman whose knowledge of royal protocol was encyclopedic, was also marked for removal. His supposed failing was asking too many questions about changes to established procedures. James remembered how Thomas had helped him navigate the complex world of royal service when he first arrived, patiently explaining traditions that went back centuries. Sarah Collins, a lady's maid who had served with distinction for 15 years, was targeted for what they termed excessive familiarity with previous arrangements. James knew this was code for her having worked closely with the previous queen consort's staff and maintaining those professional relationships. As James listened, the scope of the plan became clear. It wasn't just about removing a few individuals. It was about fundamentally altering the palace's culture and replacing experienced staff with people who would be unquestioningly loyal to the new order. The conversation revealed that over 20 positions would be affected, representing decades of combined experience and institutional knowledge. The method they planned to use was particularly troubling. Rather than direct dismissals, which would require proper procedures and might attract unwanted attention, they would create impossible working conditions. Staff members would be given conflicting instructions, denied necessary resources, and subjected to constant criticism until they either resigned or provided grounds for dismissal. Victoria Ashworth's voice was clinical as she outlined the timeline. The process would begin within days, starting with the most senior staff members who might organize resistance. Once they were gone, the remaining staff would be easier to intimidate or remove. New hiring would prioritize candidates with no previous royal service experience, ensuring complete loyalty to the current administration. James felt sick as he realized the human cost of this plan. Many of the targeted staff members had given their entire careers to royal service. They had families, mortgages, and children's education to consider. Some were approaching retirement and counted on their service records for their pensions. The plan would devastate not just the individuals involved, but their families as well. The conversation also revealed the broader motivations behind the scheme. Queen Camilla apparently felt that too many staff members were resistant to her vision for modernizing palace operations. She believed that long-time servants were undermining her authority by continuing practices from previous reigns. Victoria Ashworth fed these concerns, suggesting that only a complete transformation of the staff would allow the Queen Consort to truly establish her influence. James's military background had taught him the value of loyalty and the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. As he stood in that darkened hallway listening to plans that would destroy the careers of good people, he felt a growing sense of responsibility. Someone needed to warn the targeted staff members. Someone needed to document what was happening. Someone needed to take a stand. But James also understood the enormous risks involved. Challenging the Queen Consort's plans could end his own career instantly. He could be dismissed for eavesdropping, for insubordination, or for any number of reasons that would effectively blacklist him from similar positions. His wife Emma had recently started her own small business, and they were still paying for their daughter's university education. The financial security his position provided was crucial for his family's stability. Despite these concerns, James couldn't ignore what he had learned. His conscience wouldn't allow him to stand by while good people were destroyed by a secret campaign. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, weighing his options and trying to determine the best course of action. The next morning brought the first signs that the plan was already in motion. Margaret Thompson arrived at work to find her office had been searched and her keys to several important areas had been changed without notice. When she inquired about the changes, she was told it was part of a security review, but given no timeline for resolution. Thomas Bradley discovered that several of his responsibilities had been reassigned to newer staff members without his knowledge. When he attempted to maintain his usual standards of service, he was criticized for overstepping his revised role and told to focus only on his newly limited duties. Sarah Collins found herself assigned to impossible schedules that would require her to be in multiple locations simultaneously. When she pointed out the logistical problems, she was accused of being inflexible and resistant to necessary changes in service delivery. James watched these developments with a heavy heart, knowing they were just the beginning. The staff members under attack were confused and demoralized, unable to understand why their years of faithful service were suddenly being questioned. They began to doubt themselves, wondering if they had somehow failed to meet evolving expectations. The palace's usual efficiency began to suffer as experienced staff members were marginalized and newer employees struggled to fill gaps in knowledge and expertise. Routines that had operated smoothly for years became sources of confusion and mistakes. The very stability that had made the royal household function effectively was being deliberately undermined. During his lunch break, James made a decision that would change everything. He began documenting what he observed, carefully recording times, dates, and specific incidents. He photographed duty rosters that showed the impossible schedules being assigned to targeted staff. He made notes of conversations he witnessed, where staff members were being unfairly criticized or given contradictory instructions. James also started reaching out to his network of contacts throughout the palace staff. As a senior security officer, he had relationships with people in every department, from the kitchen staff to the private secretaries. He began asking casual questions about changes they had noticed, problems they were experiencing, and concerns they might have about recent developments. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. The pattern of harassment and impossible demands was systematic and widespread. Staff members throughout the palace were experiencing similar problems, all designed to create grounds for their dismissal or force their resignation. The plan was being implemented with military precision, targeting individuals who posed the greatest threat to complete administrative control. Emma noticed her husband's growing stress and pressed him for answers. James had always been honest with his wife about the challenges of his work, but this situation was different. Telling her about what he had discovered would make her a potential target as well. Yet keeping such a significant secret from his life partner felt like a betrayal of their relationship. Finally, James decided to share his concerns with Emma, knowing he needed her perspective and support. Her reaction was immediate and unambiguous. She reminded him of the values they had taught their children and the importance of standing up for others when they couldn't defend themselves. Emma's support strengthened James's resolve to take action, even as they both understood the risks involved. The weekend provided James with time to think and plan. He realized that simply warning the targeted staff members wouldn't be enough. The people implementing this scheme had too much power and too many resources. Any resistance that could be dismissed as individual complaints or isolated incidents would be easily overcome. James concluded that he needed to document the conspiracy comprehensively and find a way to make the information public. The royal family's reputation depended on their image as fair and honorable employers. If the British public learned about a secret campaign to destroy the careers of loyal servants, the backlash could be severe. On Monday morning, James returned to work with a new sense of purpose. He would continue gathering evidence while looking for opportunities to expose the truth. He knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but he also knew that remaining silent would make him complicit in the destruction of innocent people's lives. The palace corridors that had been his workplace for over 2 decades now felt different. Every conversation might be significant, every document could provide crucial evidence, and every decision could determine the future of dozens of families. James Morrison, a man who had always preferred to work quietly in the background, was about to step into the spotlight in defense of justice and human decency. As he took his morning position at the East Wing entrance, James made a silent promise to his colleagues who were under attack. He would use every resource at his disposal, risk everything he had built, and challenge the most powerful people in the kingdom if necessary. The battle for the soul of the royal household was about to begin, and James Morrison would not back down. James Morrison's first major breakthrough came exactly 1 week after he began his investigation. While reviewing security footage for an unrelated matter, he discovered something that would prove invaluable to his case against the conspiracy targeting palace staff members. The security system at Buckingham Palace was comprehensive, with cameras covering virtually every corridor, entrance, and common area. James had legitimate access to these recordings as part of his security duties, which allowed him to review footage without raising suspicion. What he found in the recordings from the past month painted a clear picture of coordinated harassment. The footage showed Victoria Ashworth having private meetings with department heads, always in locations away from the main administrative offices. These conversations were followed by immediate changes in how targeted staff members were treated. James could see the pattern repeating across different departments and time periods, providing visual evidence of the systematic nature of the campaign. One particularly revealing recording showed Margaret Thompson arriving for work one morning to find her office locks had been changed. The timestamp proved this occurred at 3 in the morning, hours before any legitimate maintenance would take place. More importantly, the footage showed Victoria Ashworth personally supervising the lock changes, demonstrating her direct involvement in the harassment campaign. James carefully copied relevant footage onto secured drives, ensuring he maintained proper chain of custody for potential evidence. His military background had taught him the importance of documentation that would stand up under scrutiny. Every file was time-stamped, cross-referenced, and stored in multiple locations to prevent tampering or destruction. The human cost of the conspiracy was becoming increasingly apparent as James continued his investigation. Margaret Thompson, once of the most respected members of the palace staff, was showing signs of severe stress. Her usually impeccable appearance had become disheveled, and colleagues noted that she seemed constantly anxious and distracted. Thomas Bradley's situation was equally troubling. The experienced footman had been stripped of most of his traditional responsibilities and assigned to menial tasks that didn't utilize his decades of experience. When he tried to assist with functions he had managed successfully for years, he was publicly reprimanded for exceeding his authority. The humiliation was clearly taking its toll on his morale and professional confidence. Sarah Collins had been placed in an impossible situation, where she was expected to serve multiple households simultaneously with conflicting schedules. When she inevitably failed to meet unrealistic expectations, she was written up for poor performance. The documentation being created would eventually provide grounds for her dismissal, despite her previously spotless record. James realized that time was running out for the targeted staff members. The harassment campaign was designed to create either resignations or documented performance failures within a matter of weeks. If he was going to help these people, he needed to act quickly and decisively. His investigation had also revealed the broader scope of the conspiracy. The plan wasn't limited to removing individual staff members. It was designed to fundamentally restructure the palace's entire employment system. New hiring practices would prioritize personal loyalty over experience or qualifications. Traditional training programs that passed down institutional knowledge would be eliminated in favor of simplified procedures that could be quickly taught to new employees. The financial implications were staggering. Replacing experienced staff with newcomers would cost hundreds of thousands of pounds in recruitment, training, and initial inefficiencies. The loss of institutional knowledge would be irreplaceable, potentially affecting the palace's ability to maintain its historical functions and ceremonial duties. Yet these costs seem to be considered acceptable in pursuit of complete administrative control. James's network of contacts throughout the palace had grown considerably as word quietly spread about his investigation. The staff members who had initially been reluctant to discuss their problems began sharing detailed accounts of harassment and unfair treatment. The pattern was consistent across all departments: sudden changes in duties, impossible expectations, public criticism for minor issues, and gradual isolation from important communications and decisions. Other James's most valuable sources was Patricia Williams, a senior clerk in the administrative office who had access to confidential personnel files and correspondence. Patricia had served the royal family for 28 years and was appalled by what she was witnessing. She began providing James with copies of memos and directives that revealed the coordinated nature of the campaign against longtime staff members. The documents Patricia shared were damning. They showed that performance evaluations were being rewritten to create negative records for previously exemplary employees. Disciplinary actions were being initiated for minor infractions that had historically been handled with verbal warnings. Most significantly, the documents revealed specific timelines for removing each targeted individual, with detailed strategies for avoiding legal challenges or public relations problems. James learned that Queen Camilla had been convinced that the palace staff was actively undermining her authority by maintaining loyalty to previous administrations. Victoria Ashworth had apparently presented a compelling case that only complete replacement of senior staff would allow the Queen Consort to implement her vision for modernizing royal operations. The plan had received approval at the highest levels, making it extremely difficult to challenge through normal channels. The conspiracy also involved creating new positions that would be filled by individuals with personal connections to Victoria Ashworth. These appointments would ensure complete loyalty to the new administrative structure while providing cover for the mass removal of experienced staff. The new employees would be paid significantly less than their predecessors, creating substantial cost savings that could be presented as efficient management. James's investigation revealed that several respected staff members had already been quietly forced out in recent months. Their departures had been presented as voluntary retirements or career changes, but the documentation James uncovered showed they had been subjected to the same harassment campaign now targeting others. The successful removal of these individuals had apparently convinced the conspirators that their methods were effective and undetectable. The psychological impact on the remaining staff was severe and growing worse daily. People who had dedicated their lives to royal service were beginning to doubt their abilities and question their futures. Some were considering resignation simply to escape the constant stress and humiliation. The workplace environment that had traditionally been characterized by mutual respect and shared purpose was being systematically destroyed. James knew that he needed allies if he was going to expose this conspiracy effectively. Working alone, he might be dismissed as a disgruntled employee or conspiracy theorist. He needed credible witnesses and corroborating evidence that would be difficult to ignore or discredit. His first important ally came from an unexpected source. Dr. Richard Hartwell, the palace physician, had noticed the declining health of several staff members and was concerned about the unusual pattern of stress-related symptoms he was treating. When James approached him with evidence of systematic harassment, Dr. Torre, Hartwell immediately understood the connection between the workplace problems and his patient's deteriorating health. Hartwell's medical records provided objective documentation of the conspiracy's impact on staff well-being. Multiple employees were seeking treatment for anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, and stress-related physical ailments. The timing of these health problems correlated perfectly with the beginning of the harassment campaign, providing medical evidence of the conspiracy's harmful effects. James's second crucial ally was Father Michael O'Connor, the palace chaplain, who had been counseling staff members struggling with workplace problems. Father O'Connor had initially attributed the increase in counseling requests to normal workplace stress, but James's evidence helped him recognize the systematic nature of what was happening. His testimony would carry significant weight due to his respected position and reputation for integrity. The chaplain's record showed that multiple staff members had come to him with nearly identical concerns about sudden changes in their work environment, unfair treatment by supervisors, and fears about their job security. The consistency of these accounts across different departments and time periods supported James's evidence of a coordinated campaign. Armed with growing evidence and credible allies, James began developing a strategy for exposing the conspiracy. Simply presenting the information to senior palace officials would be ineffective, since the plan had been approved at the highest levels. Traditional grievance procedures would be useless against people who controlled those very systems. James realized that he needed to find a way to make the information public while protecting himself and his sources from retaliation. The British media had a long history of interest in palace affairs, but they also had complex relationships with the royal family that might make them reluctant to pursue a story that could be embarrassing to the monarchy. His research into potential media contacts led him to investigative journalist Helen Richardson, who had a reputation for thorough, fair reporting on institutional corruption. Richardson had previously exposed wrongdoing in other high-profile organizations and had shown the ability to protect sources while pursuing difficult stories. James decided to approach her with his evidence, knowing this step would point him toward a point of no return. Before making contact with the journalist, James took steps to protect his family and prepare for potential retaliation. He moved copies of all evidence to secure locations outside the palace, ensuring that the information would survive even if he was suddenly dismissed or arrested. He also documented his own exemplary service record and gathered testimonials from colleagues who could attest to his character and reliability. Emma Morrison had watched her husband's investigation with a mixture of pride and terror. She understood the importance of what he was doing, but she also knew the enormous personal risks involved. Their conversations during this period were intense and emotional, as they both recognized that their lives might change dramatically based on James's decisions. The couple made practical preparations for potential job loss, including reviewing their financial situation and identifying alternative employment options. Emma's business was growing, but not yet stable enough to support the family alone. They also discussed the possibility of having to relocate if James's name became associated with opposition to the royal family. Despite these concerns, Emma remained supportive of her husband's decision to proceed with his investigation. She had met many of the palace staff members over the years at various social functions and understood them to be good people who deserved better treatment. Her encouragement was crucial in helping James maintain his resolve during the most difficult moments of his investigation. As the second week of his active investigation drew to a close, James Morrison had assembled a comprehensive case against the conspiracy targeting palace staff members. He had documented evidence, credible witnesses, expert testimony, and a clear timeline of coordinated harassment. The next phase would involve taking this information public and hoping that exposure would stop the systematic destruction of innocent people's careers. The stakes could not be higher. Success might save the jobs and dignity of dozens of faithful servants while exposing a serious abuse of power within one of Britain's most important institutions. Failure could result in the destruction of his own career, potential legal troubles, and the continuation of a conspiracy that would devastate many families. James understood that he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Once he contacted the journalist and shared his evidence, he would become a whistleblower, challenging some of the most powerful people in the kingdom. The quiet security guard who had spent over 2 decades working in the shadows was about to step into the brightest possible spotlight. That evening, as he reviewed his evidence one final time before making contact with Helen Richardson, James Morrison felt the weight of responsibility for the lives and careers of his colleagues. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a confrontation that would test his courage, his principles, and his commitment to justice. The battle for the integrity of the royal household was about to begin in earnest. The meeting with investigative journalist Helen Richardson took place on a rainy Thursday evening at a small cafe in South London, far from the palace and the world of royal service. James Morrison had chosen the location carefully, ensuring it was somewhere he would never normally visit and where the chances of being recognized were minimal. The weight of the evidence folder in his briefcase felt heavier with each step toward what he knew would be a life-changing conversation. Helen Richardson arrived exactly on time, her reputation for punctuality preceding her into the modest cafe. James recognized her immediately from her television appearances, though seeing her in person revealed a more approachable demeanor than her professional image suggested. She was a woman in her mid-40s with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. Her handshake was firm and her greeting direct, qualities that immediately put James at ease, despite the gravity of the situation. The initial conversation was careful and measured, with both parties assessing each other's credibility and intentions. Richardson had built her career on exposing institutional corruption and protecting sources, but she also understood the enormous implications of any story involving the royal family. James's military bearing and obvious distress convinced her that this was someone genuinely concerned about injustice rather than someone seeking personal attention or financial gain. When James began presenting his evidence, Richardson's professional demeanor intensified. She took detailed notes as he outlined the conspiracy, asked probing questions about his sources, and carefully examined each document he had assembled. Her experience in investigating complex scandals was evident in how she traced connections between different pieces of evidence and identified the most significant revelations. The security footage was particularly compelling to Richardson. The visual evidence of Victoria Ashworth personally overseeing harassment activities provided the kind of concrete proof that would be difficult for palace officials to dismiss or explain away. The timestamps and multiple camera angles created an indisputable record of systematic targeting of specific staff members. Richardson was especially interested in the medical evidence provided by Dr. Hartwell and the counseling records from Father O'Connor. The documentation of physical and emotional harm suffered by staff members elevated the story beyond mere workplace politics into a serious matter of employee welfare and potential legal violations. The pattern of stress-related illnesses correlated with the harassment timeline provided objective evidence of the conspiracy's impact. The journalist spent over 3 hours reviewing James's evidence and questioning him about his motivations, methods, and concerns. She was particularly thorough in exploring potential alternative explanations for the events he had documented, ensuring that the story would withstand scrutiny from palace lawyers and public relations experts. Her probing questions sometimes made James uncomfortable, but he appreciated her thoroughness and commitment to accuracy. Richardson explained that publishing this story would require additional corroboration and careful legal review. The implications for the royal family's reputation meant that every detail would need to be verified, and every source protected from potential retaliation. She estimated that preparing the story for publication would take at least 2 weeks, during which time James would need to continue gathering evidence while maintaining his normal duties. The conversation also covered the potential consequences for James personally. Richardson had seen other whistleblowers face severe retaliation, including job loss, legal harassment, and social ostracism. She wanted to ensure that James understood these risks and had adequate protection before proceeding. Her concern for his welfare was genuine and helped reinforce James's confidence in her integrity. Before parting ways, Richardson provided James with secure communication methods and additional evidence-gathering techniques that would strengthen their case while minimizing his exposure to discovery. She also connected him with a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protection, ensuring he would have legal support if the palace attempted retaliation before the story was published. The following days were among the most stressful of James's career as he continued his regular duties while secretly gathering additional evidence for Richardson's investigation. Every conversation with supervisors felt potentially dangerous, and every routine interaction carried the risk of discovery. The strain of maintaining normal appearances while conducting a covert investigation was enormous. James's expanded evidence gathering revealed new dimensions of the conspiracy that even he had not initially understood. The plan to remove experienced staff was part of a broader strategy to modernize palace operations, according to corporate efficiency models. Traditional practices that had evolved over centuries were being systematically eliminated in favor of standardized procedures that could be managed by less experienced personnel. This modernization effort extended beyond mere cost-cutting to include fundamental changes in how the palace related to British society and tradition. Many of the targeted staff members possessed knowledge of historical protocols, ceremonial procedures, and cultural practices that had been passed down through generations of royal service. Their removal would represent a significant loss of institutional memory and cultural continuity. The investigation also uncovered evidence that similar purges had been conducted in other royal residences with less media attention. Staff members at Windsor Castle, Sandringham, and Balmoral had experienced comparable harassment campaigns that resulted in the quiet departure of numerous longtime employees. The success of these operations had apparently encouraged the expansion of the strategy to Buckingham Palace itself. James learned that the conspiracy involved not just the removal of existing staff, but also fundamental changes to hiring and training practices. New employees would be selected primarily for their willingness to follow instructions without question, rather than their knowledge of royal traditions or commitment to service excellence. Training programs would focus on basic compliance rather than the comprehensive understanding of protocol and procedure that had traditionally characterized royal service. The financial analysis James conducted with Patricia Williams' help revealed that the short-term cost savings from replacing experienced staff would be offset by long-term efficiency losses and increased turnover. However, these economic considerations appeared to be secondary to the political goal of establishing complete administrative control over palace operations. During this period, the harassment of targeted staff members intensified significantly. Margaret Thompson was subjected to surprise inspections of her work that inevitably found minor problems to criticize. Thomas Bradley was assigned to duties that conflicted with his physical limitations, then criticized when he struggled to meet impossible demands. Sarah Collins discovered that her requests for schedule changes to accommodate family emergencies were being denied, while similar requests from other staff were routinely approved. The psychological pressure was beginning to show results, as several staff members started discussing resignation. James watched friends and colleagues he had worked with for years begin to doubt their own abilities and question whether they belonged in royal service. The conspiracy was succeeding in its goal of creating conditions that would force people to leave voluntarily, rather than face continued harassment. James's documentation of these developments provided Richardson with a day-by-day account of how the conspiracy was being implemented and its cumulative effect on both individuals and palace operations. The evidence showed that workplace efficiency was actually declining as experienced staff became demoralized and new employees struggled with unfamiliar responsibilities. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Victoria Ashworth had consolidated power within the palace administrative structure. By controlling access to senior officials and managing the flow of information about personnel matters, she had effectively become the gatekeeper for all employment decisions. This concentration of authority made the conspiracy possible while also making it difficult for affected staff members to seek redress through normal channels. James learned that several attempts by staff members to formally complain about their treatment had been intercepted and suppressed by Ashworth's office. Grievance procedures that were supposed to provide protection for employees were being manipulated to prevent complaints from reaching decision-makers who might intervene on behalf of harassed staff members. The scope of Ashworth's influence extended beyond personnel matters to include contract negotiations, vendor relationships, and budget allocations. Her position allowed her to reward allies and punish opponents throughout the palace's complex organizational structure. This power had apparently been used to build a network of supporters who would remain silent about the harassment campaign in exchange for job security and advancement opportunities. Richardson's investigation had uncovered additional sources within the palace who were willing to provide information about the conspiracy. These included mid-level administrators who had been pressured to participate in the harassment campaign, and newer employees who felt uncomfortable about the treatment of their experienced colleagues. The growing number of witnesses strengthened the story's credibility, while providing multiple perspectives on the same events. The journalist's legal review had confirmed that the harassment campaign violated numerous employment laws and could expose the palace to significant civil liability. The systematic nature of the targeting, the documented pattern of discrimination, and the clear evidence of retaliation created potential grounds for class action litigation by affected staff members. Richardson also discovered that the story had international implications due to the royal family's role as a symbol of British values and traditions. The revelation that longtime servants were being systematically mistreated would likely damage the monarchy's reputation for fairness and decency, both at home and abroad. The timing was particularly sensitive given ongoing discussions about the royal family's relevance and public support. As the investigation neared completion, James Morrison reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that evening when he overheard the conversation in the blue drawing room. The quiet security guard who had always preferred to work behind the scenes was about to become the central figure in a scandal that would reverberate throughout British society. The personal cost had already been significant. The stress of conducting a secret investigation while maintaining normal duties had affected his health, his relationship with his family, and his peace of mind. Emma Morrison had been incredibly supportive, but the uncertainty about their future had created tension that affected their entire household. James's relationships with colleagues had also become complicated by his secret role as an investigator. People he cared about were suffering while he gathered evidence rather than providing immediate help. The knowledge that he possessed information that could end their suffering but couldn't yet act on it created a sense of guilt that weighed heavily on his conscience. Despite these personal costs, James remained convinced that exposing the conspiracy was the right course of action. The alternative was allowing the systematic destruction of innocent people's careers to continue until the palace's entire culture had been transformed according to the conspirators' vision. The long-term damage to the institution of the monarchy and the immediate harm to dozens of families made action necessary regardless of personal consequences. Richardson's final review of the evidence had convinced her that the story was ready for publication. The documentation was comprehensive, the sources were credible, and the public interest in the revelation was clear. The legal protections for whistleblowers would provide some safeguards for James, though both he and the journalist understood that retaliation was likely regardless of legal protections. The night before the story was scheduled to break, James Morrison stood at his usual post in the East Wing of Buckingham Palace, knowing it would likely be one of his final shifts as a royal protection officer. Tomorrow, his name would be associated with one of the most significant palace scandals in recent memory. The quiet corridors around him would soon be filled with reporters, investigators, and officials trying to manage a crisis that would challenge the royal family's reputation and potentially transform how the monarchy operated. As he completed his evening rounds, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A chance encounter with a conspiracy had forced him to choose between personal security and moral responsibility. The decision had been difficult but ultimately clear. Some principles were worth defending regardless of the cost. Tomorrow would bring consequences that neither James nor anyone else could fully predict. But tonight, he was at peace with his decision to stand up for justice and human decency. The brave guard who had taken a stand against powerful forces was ready to face whatever came next in his fight to protect the innocent and preserve the integrity of an institution he had served faithfully for over 2 decades. The morning of publication dawned gray and drizzly, matching James Morrison's mood as he prepared for what he knew would be the most challenging day of his career. Helen Richardson's exposé was scheduled to appear in the morning edition of The Guardian, with supporting coverage planned for the evening news broadcasts. By the time James arrived at Buckingham Palace for what might be his final shift, the story would already be spreading across the internet and social media. James had barely slept the previous night, his mind racing through possible scenarios for how the day would unfold. Richardson had warned him to expect immediate suspension pending investigation, possible legal action for breach of confidentiality, and intense media attention that would make normal life impossible for weeks or months. Despite her warnings, nothing could have fully prepared him for the reality of becoming the center of a national scandal. The first indication that the story had broken came when James noticed unusual activity in the palace's communications center as he arrived for his morning shift. Staff members who normally worked regular hours were arriving early, and there was an urgency in their movements that suggested crisis management protocols had been activated. The palace's public relations machinery was clearly scrambling to respond to revelations they had not anticipated. James's immediate supervisor, Chief Security Officer William Harrington, approached him within minutes of his arrival. Harrington was a fair man who had always treated James with respect, but his expression was grim as he requested a private meeting in his office. The conversation that followed was brief and professional, though tinged with obvious disappointment that James had not brought his concerns through proper channels. Harrington informed James that he was suspended immediately pending a full investigation into allegations of misconduct, breach of confidentiality, and unauthorized access to palace communications systems. The suspension would be with pay initially, though that status could change depending on the investigation's findings. James was required to surrender his security credentials, keys, and any palace property in his possession. The process of turning in his credentials and clearing out his locker was surreal for James. Items that had been routine parts of his daily life for over 20 years suddenly felt like evidence in a criminal investigation. Colleagues watched him with a mixture of sympathy and concern, uncertain whether to treat him as a hero or a traitor. The ambiguity of their reactions reflected the complex emotions his actions had generated throughout the palace community. By mid-morning, Richardson's story had exploded across British media with an intensity that surprised even experienced royal correspondents. The combination of insider testimony, documented evidence, and the personal stories of affected staff members created a compelling narrative that captured public attention immediately. Social media amplified the story's reach, with hashtags supporting the whistleblower and condemning the conspiracy trending within hours. The story's impact was magnified by its timing, coming at a period when the royal family was already facing questions about their relevance and public support. The revelation that longtime servants were being systematically mistreated contradicted the monarchy's carefully cultivated image as a benevolent institution that valued loyalty and tradition. Public reaction was swift and largely supportive of James's decision to expose the conspiracy. Queen Camilla's public relations team found themselves in an impossible position as they tried to respond to the allegations. Denying the story's accuracy would require contradicting documented evidence and credible witnesses, while acknowledging its truth would confirm serious management failures at the highest levels of the royal household. Their initial response was a brief statement calling for a thorough investigation while declining to comment on personnel matters. The palace's crisis management efforts were complicated by the comprehensive nature of Richardson's reporting. Her story included not just the original allegations, but also detailed documentation of the harassment campaign's implementation and its effects on individual staff members. The evidence was so extensive that simple denial was not credible, forcing palace officials to acknowledge at least some validity to the concerns raised. James spent the day at home with Emma, watching the story unfold across television news programs and online platforms. The coverage was generally sympathetic to his position, portraying him as a principled whistleblower who had risked his career to protect vulnerable colleagues. Several commentators compared his actions to famous cases of institutional whistleblowing that had exposed serious wrongdoing in other organizations. The human interest angle of the story resonated particularly strongly with the British public. Television interviews with Margaret Thompson, Thomas Bradley, and Sarah Collins revealed the personal cost of the harassment campaign and generated widespread sympathy for the affected staff members. Their dignity in the face of systematic mistreatment contrasted sharply with the calculated cruelty of their persecutors. Parliamentary interest in the story developed quickly as opposition politicians recognized an opportunity to criticize the government's oversight of royal finances and management practices. Questions were raised about whether public funding of the royal household should continue if employees were being mistreated systematically. The story thus evolved from a palace scandal into a broader political issue with implications for the monarchy's future. Victoria Ashworth's position became untenable within hours of the story's publication. Her role as the architect of the harassment campaign was documented extensively in Richardson's reporting, making it impossible for the palace to distance itself from her actions while retaining her services. By afternoon, palace sources were briefing journalists that her resignation was being sought, though no official announcement had been made. The international dimension of the story emerged as foreign media outlets picked up Richardson's reporting and began examining similar issues in other European monarchies. The British royal family's reputation abroad, always important for diplomatic and economic reasons, was clearly suffering damage that would require significant effort to repair. Tourism industry representatives expressed concern about potential impacts on visitor interest in royal sites and ceremonies. James received numerous phone calls throughout the day from journalists seeking additional interviews and comments on the story's development. Richardson had advised him to limit his media appearances initially, allowing the documented evidence to speak for itself while avoiding statements that might provide grounds for legal action against him. However, the volume of interest made it clear that his anonymity was permanently lost. The most challenging call came from his daughter at university, who had seen the story online and was concerned about her father's situation and the family's future. James had to explain why he had taken such drastic action without consulting her, while also reassuring her that they would manage whatever consequences arose from his decision. Emma's support during this conversation was crucial in maintaining family unity during an extremely stressful period. Legal developments began almost immediately as employment lawyers contacted both James and the affected staff members about potential civil action against the palace. The documented evidence of systematic harassment provided strong grounds for claims of constructive dismissal, discrimination, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The potential financial liability to the royal household could reach millions of pounds if multiple employees pursued successful legal action. The palace's internal investigation was announced by evening, headed by an external law firm with no previous connection to royal service. The investigation would examine all allegations raised in Richardson's story and would have access to personnel files, security footage, and other relevant documentation. However, critics noted that the investigators would be paid by the palace, potentially creating conflicts of interest that could affect their findings. James learned that several other staff members had come forward with additional evidence of harassment and discrimination following the story's publication. People who had been afraid to speak out initially were now willing to share their experiences, knowing that James had broken the silence that had protected the conspiracy. Their testimonies would strengthen any legal action, while also providing additional evidence for the palace investigation. The story's political implications expanded throughout the day as members of parliament from multiple parties called for hearings on royal household management practices. The Public Accounts Committee announced plans to review the use of public funds in palace operations, while the Culture, Media and Sport Committee indicated interest in examining the monarchy's employment practices. James's decision to expose the conspiracy had thus triggered broader scrutiny of royal institutions. Emma Morrison found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight as journalists sought to learn more about the whistleblower's family and motivations. Her small business received unexpected attention that was both positive and negative, with some customers expressing support for her husband's actions, while others questioned his loyalty to the royal family. The mixed reactions reflected broader public divisions about the appropriate balance between institutional loyalty and moral responsibility. The evening news coverage included analysis suggesting that the scandal could force broader reforms in how the royal household operated. Management practices that had evolved over centuries, with little external oversight, were suddenly subject to public scrutiny and criticism. The monarchy's traditional insulation from normal employment laws and regulations was being questioned in ways that could have lasting constitutional implications. James received a phone call from Dr. Hartwell expressing gratitude for bringing the conspiracy to light and relief that his patients would no longer face systematic harassment. The physician's support meant a great deal to James, as it confirmed that his actions had indeed helped people who were suffering and unable to protect themselves. Similar calls from other palace staff members reinforced his conviction that exposure was necessary despite personal costs. The conspiracy's broader implications for royal tradition and institutional memory became clearer as experts analyzed Richardson's reporting. The systematic removal of experienced staff represented not just employment issues, but cultural destruction that could affect the monarchy's ability to maintain historical practices and ceremonies. The loss of institutional knowledge could have consequences lasting far beyond the immediate personnel disputes. Richardson called James that evening to update him on additional developments and to prepare him for increased scrutiny in the coming days. Other media outlets were developing their own angles on the story, and James could expect interview requests from major television programs and international news organizations. She advised him to consider hiring a public relations professional to help manage the attention while protecting his family's privacy. The day had exceeded James's expectations in terms of public response and media coverage, but had also confirmed his fears about personal consequences. His career as a royal protection officer was effectively over, regardless of any investigation's findings. His family's privacy had been permanently compromised, and their financial security was uncertain. However, the positive public reaction and the relief expressed by affected staff members reinforced his belief that the disclosure was morally necessary. As the day concluded, James Morrison reflected on the transformation of his life from quiet civil servant to public figure in the space of a few hours. The morning had begun with uncertainty about how the story would be received. It ended with national debate about royal accountability and institutional reform. His decision to speak out had indeed stopped a conspiracy that was destroying innocent people's careers, though the full consequences of that decision were still unfolding. The battle James had begun by secretly documenting harassment was now a public confrontation involving Parliament, the media, legal system, and British society as a whole. The quiet guard who had taken a brave stand was no longer fighting alone. He had inspired others to join a broader effort to ensure accountability and justice within one of Britain's most important institutions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight James Morrison could rest knowing that his courage had made a difference in the lives of people who had been suffering in silence. 6 months after the scandal broke, James Morrison stood in the witness box of the Central London Employment Tribunal, preparing to give testimony that would conclude one of the most significant workplace discrimination cases in British legal history. The tribunal hearing represented the culmination of his brave decision to expose the systematic harassment of palace staff members, though the journey to this moment had been far more complex and challenging than anyone could have anticipated. The immediate aftermath of Richardson's exposé had indeed triggered the widespread reforms that many observers had predicted. Within 2 weeks of publication, Victoria Ashworth had resigned her position amid intense public pressure and clear evidence of her central role in orchestrating the harassment campaign. Queen Camilla had been forced to issue a public statement expressing regret for the treatment of staff members and promising comprehensive changes to palace employment practices. The external investigation commissioned by the palace had largely confirmed Richardson's reporting, though its language was more diplomatic than the journalist's stark accusations. The investigators found evidence of systematic management failures that had created inappropriate workplace conditions for numerous employees. While stopping short of using terms like conspiracy or harassment campaign, the report's findings were damning enough to force significant organizational changes. James's suspension had been lifted after 6 weeks, but his return to the palace had been brief and uncomfortable. Despite official vindication of his concerns, many colleagues remained divided about his decision to go public rather than working through internal channels. The atmosphere was tense enough that James ultimately decided to accept an early retirement package, ending his 23-year career in royal protection several years sooner than he had planned. The legal ramifications of the scandal had been extensive and costly for the royal household. Margaret Thompson, Thomas Bradley, Sarah Collins, and 14 other staff members had filed discrimination claims that were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts rumored to total several £1 million. The settlement agreements included provisions for positive employment references and commitments to policy changes designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The parliamentary scrutiny triggered by James's revelations had resulted in new oversight mechanisms for royal household employment practices. The Public Accounts Committee had issued a critical report on palace management that included specific recommendations for preventing workplace harassment and ensuring accountability for senior administrators. While the royal family retained significant autonomy in internal affairs, they now faced regular reviews of their employment practices and use of public funds. Emma Morrison's small business had ultimately benefited from the publicity surrounding her husband's actions. Many customers had expressed admiration for the family's principled stand, leading to increased business that helped offset James's lost income during his period of unemployment. The initial uncertainty about their financial future had resolved more positively than either of them had dared hope during the darkest days of the scandal. The broader impact on the royal family's reputation had been significant but not permanently damaging. Public opinion polls showed initial drops in approval ratings that gradually recovered, as the palace implemented promised reforms and demonstrated genuine commitment to treating employees fairly. The monarchy's survival of the scandal had actually strengthened its long-term position by showing capacity for self-correction and responsiveness to legitimate criticism. James's role as a whistleblower had evolved from controversial to heroic in public perception, as the full extent of the harassment campaign became clear through tribunal proceedings and media investigations. He had received awards from civil liberties organizations and employment rights groups, recognizing his courage in speaking out against institutional abuse of power. These honors provided some compensation for the personal costs his decision had entailed. The employment tribunal hearing itself had been a cathartic experience for the affected staff members, providing a formal forum where their experiences were acknowledged and validated. Margaret Thompson's testimony about the psychological impact of having her office searched and her responsibilities questioned had been particularly powerful, reducing several observers to tears as she described her sense of betrayal and humiliation. Thomas Bradley's account of being assigned duties that conflicted with his physical limitations and then criticized for struggling to meet impossible demands had illustrated the calculated cruelty of the harassment campaign. His dignity in recounting these experiences while maintaining respect for the institution he had served faithfully had impressed even the palace's legal representatives. Sarah Collins had testified about the impossible scheduling conflicts created for her, and the denial of reasonable accommodation requests that were routinely granted to other staff members. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the systematic nature of the discrimination and the clear pattern of targeting specific individuals based on their perceived loyalty to previous administrations. Dr. Hartwell's medical testimony had provided objective evidence of the conspiracy's impact on staff health and well-being. His documentation of increased stress-related illnesses, anxiety disorders, and depression among targeted staff members had corroborated the personal accounts with clinical evidence that could not be disputed or dismissed as subjective complaints. Father O'Connor's testimony about the increase in counseling requests and the consistent nature of staff concerns had added another dimension to the evidence of systematic harassment. His position as palace chaplain and his reputation for discretion and integrity had made his testimony particularly credible and influential in establishing the scope of the problem. Helen Richardson had testified about her investigation and the comprehensive evidence James had provided, praising his thoroughness and professionalism in documenting the harassment campaign. Her testimony had helped establish James's credibility and demonstrated that his allegations were based on careful investigation rather than personal grievances or speculation. The tribunal's ruling had been unequivocal in finding that the affected staff members had been subjected to systematic discrimination and harassment that violated their employment rights. The decision praised James's courage in exposing the conspiracy, while noting that institutional channels had been ineffective due to the involvement of senior administrators in the harassment campaign. Victoria Ashworth had not testified at the tribunal, having relocated to the private sector, where her reputation for aggressive management was apparently seen as an asset rather than a liability. Her absence from the proceedings was noted by the tribunal as contributing to the difficulty in fully understanding the motivations behind the harassment campaign, though the evidence of her involvement was overwhelming. The reforms implemented by the palace following the scandal had been comprehensive and genuine. New policies protected employees from retaliation for raising concerns about workplace treatment, established independent channels for reporting harassment, and created regular reviews of management practices by external experts. Training programs for supervisors emphasized respectful treatment of all staff members regardless of their length of service or perceived loyalties. The cultural changes within the palace had been more gradual but equally significant. The fear and uncertainty that had characterized staff relationships during the conspiracy had been replaced by renewed confidence in job security and fair treatment. Morale surveys conducted by independent consultants showed dramatic improvements in workplace satisfaction and trust in management. James's new career as a consultant on whistleblower protection and institutional reform had emerged naturally from his experience and the recognition he had received for his actions. Organizations facing similar challenges sought his advice on creating safe channels for employees to report misconduct and protecting those who spoke out against wrongdoing. His work provided both personal fulfillment and financial security, while allowing him to help others facing similar ethical dilemmas. The Morrison family had ultimately grown stronger through the ordeal, with their shared commitment to doing what was right, reinforcing their bonds and providing a foundation for moving forward. Their daughter had expressed pride in her father's actions during her university graduation speech, crediting his example with inspiring her own commitment to social justice in her chosen career. The long-term implications of James's decision extended far beyond the immediate case, to influence broader discussions about institutional accountability and individual moral responsibility. His example had inspired other whistleblowers to come forward in various organizations, contributing to a cultural shift toward greater transparency and accountability in British institutions. Academic studies of the case had identified James's thorough documentation and strategic approach to disclosure as a model for effective whistleblowing that protected both the whistleblower and the institution involved. His methods had been incorporated into training programs for civil servants and corporate employees facing ethical dilemmas in their workplaces. The case had also contributed to legislative discussions about strengthening legal protections for whistleblowers and expanding the circumstances under which disclosure of misconduct was protected from retaliation. James had testified before parliamentary committees considering reforms to whistleblower protection laws, sharing insights from his experience to help craft more effective policies. As James concluded his testimony at the employment tribunal, he reflected on the journey that had begun with an overheard conversation in the blue drawing room and culminated in comprehensive institutional reform. The personal costs had been significant, but the outcomes had justified his decision to speak out against injustice and abuse of power. The quiet security guard who had spent over 2 decades working in the shadows had become a symbol of moral courage and institutional accountability. His willingness to risk everything to protect vulnerable colleagues had not only saved their careers, but had also strengthened the very institution he had served faithfully throughout his adult life. The palace corridors that had once witnessed systematic harassment now operated under policies designed to prevent such abuses and protect employees who raised concerns about misconduct. The culture of fear and intimidation had been replaced by renewed commitment to the values of fairness, respect, and dignity that should characterize any workplace, especially one serving the British people. James Morrison's brave stand against Camilla's secret firing plot had achieved its intended purpose while also creating lasting changes that would protect future generations of palace staff. The conspiracy had been exposed, the conspirators held accountable, and the victims vindicated through both official recognition and financial compensation. As he left the tribunal building for the final time, James knew that his decision to speak out had been vindicated not just by legal victory, but by the knowledge that innocent people had been protected, and a great institution had been strengthened through accountability and reform. The guard who had taken a stand against powerful forces had proven that individual courage could indeed triumph over systematic injustice, creating a legacy that would inspire others facing similar moral challenges. The story that began with secret conversations and whispered harassment had ended with public vindication and institutional transformation. James Morrison's name would be remembered not as a disloyal employee who betrayed his employer, but as a principled individual who placed human dignity and justice above personal security, inspiring others to stand up for what is right regardless of the personal cost involved.